Last week's council elections were poor for Labour, disastrous for the Tories, and excellent for the Greens and Lib Dems. That's led many to label the results a Remain backlash or Remainers first revenge. However, that wasn't the message briefed by Jeremy Corbyn, who said on Friday it was very, very clear that voters wanted to get a deal done, and Brexit talks continue this week between the Labour and Tory frontbenchers. Meanwhile, Britain's relationship to the EU isn't the only constitutional question currently subject to political wrangling, as the SNP are ramping up their moves towards a second referendum for Scottish independence, which thankfully hasn't been christened with its own portmanteau. It's not Skexit.
Well, not yet.
It's IndyRef 2, which is much nicer to say, I think. So to make sense of all of these issues, I'm delighted to be joined by a friend of the show, Grace Blakeley.
Hey.
Economics editor at The New Statesman.
How's it going?
Yeah, I'm very well. How are you?
Good, not bad. Can't complain.
And I'm also joined by Paul Sweeney, MP for Glasgow North East, who has brought his own backdrop with him.
Yeah, very scenery.
Our audience don't know you yet, so
Right.
Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, I was born and bred in Glasgow, as you might be able to tell from by a bit of subliminal advertising for Glasgow's centenary May Day from the Battle of George Square. But I was elected at the last general election in a seat that the first Labour MP was elected in 1922 was Keir Hardie's brother, George Hardie. It was a Labour seat until 1931 when it was lost when Ramsay MacDonald betrayed the Labour movement. To the Communist Party split the vote and a Tory won the seat, but it was won back in 1935 by George, and it was held as a Labour seat all the way through to 2015, one of the safest Labour seats in the UK, including the Speaker, Michael Martin, the late Speaker Michael Martin. And then it was lost in the backlash from the 2014 independence referendum when Labour lost it on a 39% swing to the SNP.
Wow.
So it was a massive collapse in the Labour vote, working class, traditional left-wing vote, and was more or less written off as a Labour gain in 2017, but I managed to buck the trend and
What was your swing?
win it back, 12%.
That's not bad.
Not bad, but we've got more to do.
And now you have to fight hard for your 200 majority.
Exactly, 242, 7th most marginal Labour seat in the UK. So a bit of a fight in my hands to keep it.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about the state of Labour in Scotland a little bit later. We'll start with the council elections. I'm not sure if Gary's got the image, actually, but I'll read out some of the results. So the Conservatives lost 1,330 seats. Labour lost 84. The Lib Dems gained 704. The Greens gained 194. UKIP lost 145. And others, who we don't know exactly who they are. There were lots of independents standing. I think they gained 661. I'll start with you, Grace, resident Lexeter. These results have been described by many as a Remain backlash. Obviously, the only two major parties who are winning votes there are the only two major parties who have explicitly backed a second referendum. What do you make of that?
I mean, perhaps unsurprisingly, I don't think that this is evidence of a Remain backlash. I think you have to look at the seats that are being contested, which are primarily in Tory heartlands, and a lot of Conservatives stayed at home in kind of protest at the Conservatives' handling of Brexit. There are a couple of seats where the Lib Dems basically won like a tiny margin more than they won in the last election, but they managed it because a load of Conservative voters just didn't turn out. There's definitely rising support for the Greens across the board, who obviously did really well. I think that's at least partly to do with the fact that the number of voters saying that the environment is their biggest concern has shot up to something like, I think it was like 27% on the last poll.
Their biggest concern?
Yeah.
Wow. That is a turnaround.
Yeah. Don't quite. I think that was right. I'm pretty sure I heard that.
That's good enough for us. That's good enough for us.
I mean, whatever. Someone will Google it.
You can Google it if you doubt it.
Yeah, someone Google it. And yeah, as I said, Lib Dems won on the back of, Tories staying at home. I'm sure there was some, this all had something to do with some Remain voters feeling very, upset with the major parties over Brexit. But I think it's very different from saying that, a swing towards these parties, which has been very chaotic, very difficult to discern any patterns from, particularly when you look at some of the voting patterns in the North East, in 300 seats in local council elections with, average, if not slightly below turnout, is in any way going to give you a good indication of what the country is feeling on this issue, especially if you compare it to the polls for the upcoming European elections, which are literally proportional and will account for how every vote across the country in that sense.
I mean, for those European elections, I don't want to go into too much depth about them, but the Remain parties are on sort of 10% each, so it basically adds up to the same as the Brexit party. They just got.
But if you look at all the parties that in one way or another support Brexit, they're like streets ahead. They're like 60-70%.
Labour,
But even without Labour, like the Brexit party's on like 30 something, UKIP's on like 10, the Tories are on like 20.
Yeah, I think it makes up about maybe it makes 60 odd percent or something. Paul, you are on the record, I think, as being very much in favour of a second referendum.
Yeah.
Are your lot cynically using these results, which are actually explained by local issues, to propagandise in favour of their preferred outcome?
Well, I'm not enthusiastic about a second referendum. I've arrived at this position through a process of deduction. Having been a bruised veteran of 2 referendums in recent years, I don't embrace them as particularly pleasant devices in democratic discourse. But that aside, looking at these results, the key thing that I took away from them was the transfer seemed to mainly happen from Conservative voters to Liberal Democrats. So actually what you were seeing was Tory Remainers transferring their votes to Liberal Democrats. Actually, even in Leave areas, what you saw was the Labour vote actually was relatively stable, as far as I could see, which suggests that the people who lost ground most in these results is actually the Conservative Party. And I think, to an extent, both main parties were destined to suffer a degree of a setback because people are frustrated with the impasse in Parliament, and the narrative in the media has been about this deadlock in Parliament. Being an MP, a new one, relatively, I sense the frustration because the narrative, the British political narrative just now is stuck in a constitutional rut. We're not really talking about the issues that garnered so much enthusiasm for Labour in the 2017 general election. We were able to break through that narrative about the constitution and talk about socialist issues. And I think people are just so frustrated at the record being stuck just now that they want to kick it. And maybe they felt voting for parties that were up for disrupting the status quo, if you like, were in the constitutional sense were the way to go in this election, with it being a bit of a free hit, because it didn't necessarily mean you were going to be imprisoned with a Tory government again. Maybe that's the way that people voted. I sense that if anything, turnout was quite down. People were disillusioned. Generally speaking, it's hard to motivate voters to come out for local elections and even European elections as well. How many people can name their MEP? So I wouldn't read too much into from a Labour point of view. But my conclusions about where we need to go from the constitutional side of the Brexit debate is not really dependent on the results of these elections. It's an
independent argument. It's
a considered point of view, based on a scepticism about the validity of referendums, but recognising that maybe the only way to really clarify the position, ratify the position, is to sort of distill it down and then test it again.
Okay, we're going to do Brexit properly in a moment, when we're talking about the negotiations that are going on between Labour and the Tories. First of all, Grace, you wrote a fabulous article, we might be able to get it up, for the New Statesman about the Preston Model, about what Labour should be doing on the ground if they want to boost their vote shares, if they want to take control of local government without relying on national trends, I suppose. So what have they been doing in Preston? What have they been doing right?
Yeah, so Preston's this really exciting model. It's the council led by Matthew Brown. They've just had this massive turnaround after it was, I think, 2011, a couple of years after the financial crisis. They had Preston was not doing very well economically, on a whole load of other social indicators, and they were putting all their eggs in this basket of this big shopping centre opening, and a load of kind of companies were getting in on this, and it was going to be huge. It was going to be one of the biggest shopping malls like in the UK, and but eventually one of the parts of the consortium, one of the companies in the consortium, pulled out, and it all collapsed. So they were like, shit, what are we going to do? Matthew Brown comes along and says, look, we need to try this new model. We need to look over the Atlantic, look towards Cleveland, which had obviously been suffering from kind of decades of post-industrial decline, and been rescued by a kind of local movement, really, supported by the local government and the Democracy Collaborative, which is a kind of US think and do tank. I
love the way that think and do tank is now just
I've
part
been
of your
in the
vocabulary. You don't even have to
US
explain
with
it.
them for a while, and so that's how they would describe themselves. They like come up with policy and then try and do it on the ground. And the model in the UK is CLES, the Centre for Local Economic Strategies that supported Preston do the same thing. In Cleveland they built this idea of community wealth building, which is essentially based on the idea that you attempt to kind of embed local capital by using the combined economic weight of what they call anchor institutions, so institutions that can't move, universities, public services like the NHS, local government, education, etc. Get them to kind of come together to use their procurement budgets in order to prioritize local companies, get them to prioritize corporations that are unionized, that may be cooperatives, and bring that together with a kind of a load of other strategies aimed at boosting kind of democratic, mutual, cooperative, collective ownership locally, and also doing things like setting up local banks. Generally, any intervention that's aimed at, as I said, kind of embedding capital in the local community. So they did this in Cleveland, and it had amazing results. They set up a load of cooperatives that are still going to this day. They were really successful in using those procurement budgets to keep to kind of boost the local economy. And in Preston, they followed that model as well and just had a massive turnaround. They were rated the most improved council, I think it was last year, and they've succeeded in massively increasing the amount of budget that's spent by all those institutions within Lancashire on the one hand, and then within Preston on the other. And that's pushed up obviously economic outcomes and social outcomes across the board. And it's kind of a reaction against this this very like neoliberal model of running a council, which is based on the idea that you should be outsourcing services, providing them as cheaply as possible, and shrinking down the council, which can come to act as a kind of mediator between private interests rather than a provider of services itself. And the kind of the classic idea of that is like Barnett, which came up with this idea of one council where capita was just kind of brought in to run everything. And according to kind of the traditional neoclassical economic thinking on this, where these corporations are and who runs them shouldn't matter. It's all about doing things as cheaply as possible so there's more capital to go around for everyone. But of course, a lot of these corporations are run out of, what they're owned by kind of investors in the city. They pay, we saw like with Carillion, they're highly indebted. They treat their workers badly. They treat their suppliers badly. They pay out huge dividends. And they're just generally kind of mechanisms for extraction, both from the public sector itself and from local communities. And it was, kind of a pushback against that to say, just because we're living under austerity doesn't mean that this is the only way forward for councils, that they have to, do this model of kind of outsourcing that's screwed over so many parts of the country. And it is really exciting. I mean, I've actually writing this week about the limits of that. So the fact that this is a really exciting new model that Labour councils should be taking up and that the leadership should be encouraging, but it's not enough without much more funding, without much greater devolution. Actually, that's a big part of it, without kind of making local government powerful again, which is also about kind of improving democratic accountability locally and making people feel
what
closer
more powers
to the
do they
state.
need?
I'd say they need powers to be able to raise more taxes locally, to issue bonds in order to invest in infrastructure.
I thought the government just changed their position on that
they
councils can now borrow to build.
They can borrow, but they can borrow from banks. So they've been borrowing for ages. They can't issue bonds.
What's quite interesting is that other countries constitutionally protect local government as a specific tier of government in a written constitution. Like Norway, for example, 40% of all tax raised by the state doesn't go beyond local government. In the UK, we suck everything up in a big hoover and drop it through the treasury, and it all filters back down into the subsidiary levels of government. So by doing that, it neuters the local government's capacity. So I'm like, this is music to my ears as a cooperative MP, certainly. The rediscovery of a municipal route to socialism in Britain would be a fantastic policy measure to put at the heart of a Labour government. It sounds exactly what we should be sort of recapturing at the heart of the movement. And think of an example in Scotland, like Joe Cullen, the leader of North Ayrshire Council, has been showcasing how we can do that with very limited means, because local government, the budgets are controlled 90% by the government in Edinburgh, and they've been slashing them at a rate 7 to 10 times more than the Scottish government's had budget cuts. So then this notion that the SNP are somehow this beacon of this resistant beacon of progressivism in Scotland against Toryism is not true at all. In fact, they're amplifying cuts to local government. And Joe Clane, his dad's just become the president of the STUC, for example. Like, really great tradition of municipal socialism there. So, it's one to watch as well, despite the frustrations the local government's faced in Scotland.
So that's what local councils should be doing. Obviously, this wasn't an amazing result for Labour in these local elections. It was in Preston, actually. They raised it's difficult to make direct comparisons because they'd had a load of boundary changes, but they moved from 61% of the seats to 62.5% of the seats. So they've moved forwards ever so slightly when lots of places are moving backwards. Any idea why not that many Labour councils are doing this? Why do we have so many shit Labour councils is one way of putting it.
I mean, what's quite funny, given the state of councils in the 70s and given why so many of their powers were sucked away, is that councils today across the country are becoming this kind of last bastion of Blairism. And as I said, kind of they've developed over really the last, as local governments become more marginalised and therefore less democratically accountable, you've had these these just very just close relationships build up between local government, local councillors, and these private organisations that have been brought in to outsource lots of services. I mean, Capita particularly is one in local government that has a huge amount of responsibility for delivering those services. And I think that's all driven as well by all the logic that was brought in for running public services under Blair, all about new public management and making the state work like a business. And I think under austerity that's just escalated because that logic has been embedded, that ideology has been embedded, that the state, especially local states, should work like businesses. And again, this is all part of a much wider discourse around what space and what place is under, neoliberalism and financial capitalism, which is that places should compete against one another for investment.
It's an interesting example. I'm going to refer to the poster behind me, but back then,
as often as you like,
100 years ago, when it was the Glasgow Corporation run as a socialist council, then you had the gas supply on the municipal control, electricity, tramways, subway system, even the telephone exchange. There was municipal hospitals before the NHS. All these things were being done by socialist agendas in local government long before we had these great national institutions like the NHS. In a way, we need to recapture that. But to think of how Glasgow City Council looks today compared to what it was 100 years ago, you can see the effect that 40 years of neoliberalism's had on it. The capacity, the entire municipal housing stock's been turned over. Even the car parking's been privatised, or they've been split off into arm's length companies. So basically what the council decided to do, because it was faced with such massive financial pressure from the centre, was to try and liquidate as much of its assets as it could by basically selling, turning elements of how the council works into companies. So like the leisure centres were formed into a company. The car parking was formed into a company. The care service, free personal care. And basically the council sold those assets to itself and then mortgaged its assets, but now is in massive debt, just to sustain services and avoid cuts that were being imposed from the centre. And now it's found itself in massive financial stress. And also that's resulted in a huge equal pay dispute that's happened in Glasgow, where for the last 10 years, women have been, for longer than that, but women have been structurally paid less than their male counterparts because there isn't the financial capacity in local government to properly address the issue, the historical issue of pay and justice for women. So that was essentially attempts to fix that problem, which was because central government wasn't willing to actually intervene to solve the problem or help councils solve the problem. Councils basically massively fragmented and marketised their assets to try and solve the problem, did it in a botched way, and resulted in many women finding themselves £30,000-40,000 out of pocket.
Is there a struggle going on about that?
Well, there was in Glasgow. There's been a massive struggle led by the women themselves, with their trade unions, Unison and GMB in particular, to fight against it, and they've forced through a court action. Glasgow City Council, they achieved a victory with the unions and a guy called Stefan Cross, who represented a lot of the women independently, but they had to fight all through the courts for the last 10 years to do that. And the issue, I think, in local government is also a crisis of democracy. When you think about it, a councillor, certainly in Scotland, the councillor gets £16,000 a year. So it means that it's not a full-time job essentially.
That's more than here though. 16k a year.
Yeah, even in England.
Because in London, I think it's like 11k or
Is
something.
it?
Well, it's somewhere between 10 and 13, I think, depending on the council.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, the point is that councillors are, you think of the swathe of things that are under council control: planning law, licensing laws, roads. I get loads of people coming to me with these problems because they don't understand the sort of demarcation between a councillor, a member of the Scottish Parliament, and a member of Parliament in Westminster. And that's a function of a lack of political education generally in our country.
And then you get a councillor who rubber stamped something which was suggested by KPMG when they came in to do the consultation.
Yeah, exactly. And also the problem is when you've got part-time councillors, the balance of power between officers, undemocratic officers in councils versus the democratic membership who are meant to hold the whole system to account is massively unbalanced. So you end up with kind of low-level corruption creeping in, or just very lazy decision-making, very poor decision-making and bad policy that isn't kept in check by a democratic process. And that's why people feel so disillusioned by councils, because it's a combination of defunding, de-resourcing, marketising their assets, fragmenting them, and then you have that combination with no democratic check or very poor democratic check. Those things combined are really toxic. And when I'm talking to my community and organisations in my community, what I'm hearing is every year services that used to be provided by the state or by the council are being extracted. Quality of life provision of services has been pulled out. So third sector charities are filling that void, and every year there's a lottery basically for a charity to figure out whether it's got its funding. So they're spending like 30-40% of their time not helping people on the ground. They're actually thinking about next year's funding and how to apply for it. So it creates this really cruel cycle of people just fighting for an ever-diminishing supply of funding.
And then if the charity sort of randomly collapses, like Kids Company did, I don't know if that was everywhere, but in London it collapsed where I was living at the time in Lambeth.
Exactly.
And that just meant the next day all the youth services shut.
Yeah.
Which wouldn't happen if it was local government, because that wouldn't be...
Yeah, that question of democratic accountability is really important. That book Behind Your Head, Ruling the Void by Peter Mayer makes that point really well, that we've kind of gotten to this position where the state, whether nationally or locally, operates in this kind of clientelistic way, where absent democratic accountability, either because of low turnout or because huge swathes of policy making, at the national level, think of kind of monetary policy, locally because of outsourcing or whatever, huge swathes are taken out of the direct control of people with a democratic mandate, and that has just served to create this kind of, well, firstly the rule by experts that was so such a kind of rallying cry in the referendum, saying we're rebelling against this idea that these people at the top can tell us what to do, and also this just general feeling of mistrust in and alienation from all of our state and collective institutions. And I think that plays into as well this kind of what people often describe as kind of feeling this like breakdown of community and social cohesion and all these things that people talk about and that come up quite a lot when you're talking about local elections. And that has a huge amount to do with the breakdown of the kind of local community sphere that was initially kind of centred around local government and all those community institutions that have been eviscerated.
Andy Whiteman, who's a Green member of the Scottish Parliament, has written a really good paper about local government in Scotland, and one of the key conclusions is Scotland has 32 councils for a population of 5 million, but it's one of the most centralised countries in Europe in terms of its governance. And even as recently as the 1970s, there was 100 odd councils in Scotland. So what you've seen is an extraction of that local accountability from communities, where like the person who was responsible for planning, the fire service, the police service, used to live at the end of your street and you could go down and have a chat with the local councillor because you knew who they were on a personal level. That connection's been disrupted. So that level of personal interaction with democratic accountability has been massively diluted. I mean, I represent a constituency of 80,000 people. I always visualise it like a football stadium. It's like Wembley or something like that. Trying to represent that many people. The practicalities of having to represent that many people are massively constraining. So that's a big problem, a dilution of democracy. I mean, the Tories are talking about cutting the number of MPs to 600 in a country with a growing population. They're just further entrenching that sense of alienation from their democratic representatives.
I mean, we can afford 650, to be honest, can't we? But the financial argument doesn't make that much sense.
No, especially with 800 lords.
As you know, Tisky Sour is only possible because of your support. Novara Media is only possible because of your kind support. So if you are already donating, thank you. If you are not, please go to support.novaramedia.com and subscribe. As you know, our ask is for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Also, I'm going to advertise something different to you today, which is Acid Corbynism FM. Someone was going to have sent me the blurb, but I haven't looked at it yet. But I've heard it's very good. It's about, I haven't listened to it yet, but it's about music, culture, and Corbyn. And I have genuinely heard very good things about it.
It's Jeremy Gilbert, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jeremy
So
Gilbert
it will
is
be
great.
great.
It will
Yeah.
be good. We know it will be good. Keir Milburn,
Oh,
who is
okay.
also one of
All
very
the-
recent of
yeah,
RFM,
great.
which was very good.
Very good book that I just read. Generation Z.
Some extra things, obviously, like this video. Obviously, share it on Facebook, share it on Twitter. We want more people to see it. Let's talk about the Brexit talks. But quite quickly, I think, because we talk about Brexit too much.
Yeah.
And we don't talk about Scotland very often, so we'll go on to that in a little
Bored
bit.
of Brexit.
But the Brexit talks, if you're bored, I'll frame it around your boredom. We're all bored of Brexit. Does that mean that Labour and the Tories, Jeremy Corbyn and Theresa May, should get on with it and come to some compromise? Alex Wickham was reporting today. I mean, it was also briefed on the weekend. But so this is a quote from him today. May's aides are pursuing a strategy of essentially attempting to bounce the opposition into agreeing a deal by capitulating to their key demands. So what's being briefed is that the Tory party are offering a customs union until the next general election, at which point both parties could go to the country with a vision in the manifesto of what they want the long-term relationship with the EU to be like, and also to put into law a dynamic alignment of workers' rights. So that means that at the moment in the withdrawal agreement, we can't lower Britain's workers' rights to lower than what they currently are in the European Union, whereas this is saying if the European Union raise workers' rights, we will do it too. And what was the final one? I don't know, it's all detail, isn't it? Should they accept it? If they've capitulated to all of our demands, presumably at this point, you have to say, fine, we'll do it. Let's get on with it. Let's do the deal.
Well, first of all, I don't believe that that's the case, that they have capitulated. I don't think that's true. And if it isn't true, then acceptance of any deal on those terms would be objectively acquiescing to Toryism. And that is unacceptable to me as a Labour MP. Therefore, I can't support that idea that you could be enabling a right-wing Tory agenda. So that's why I would be opposed to voting for that deal in
But
those
if they're
terms.
capitulating, so what of Labour's demands do you not think they're capitulating to?
Well, I don't believe there's been an agreement on dynamic alignment with workers' rights. I think actually an agreement on the terms of the single market, that's insufficient as well, because there's also issues around a just immigration policy. There's issues around whether it serves the needs of all the nations and regions in the UK as well, which was part of Labour's tests, if you remember, this infamous
bollocks.
6 tests.
The 6 bollocks tests.
Which one could accuse of being impossibilist.
But you're sticking to them.
But I believe they were logical, and no, I think in this current context, it would be enabling neoliberalism, enabling a Tory Brexit. So I wouldn't be content with it. I think what people ought to be invited to consider is, in any sort of referendum of a binary nature like the one we had in 2016, you're asking a very simple answer to what is an extremely complex question. And the result of that is we saw in Scotland in 2014, which was an extremely frustrating experience for me because I didn't agree with no and I didn't agree with yes. I was somewhere in between. Similarly, I'm not a Europhile by any sense of the imagination. I actually believe that the single market is constructed as a Thatcherite project. So there's things about Europe that I find far from satisfactory, but on the balance of risks and opportunities, I decided that Remain was a better opportunity for effecting change positively towards socialist objectives than removing ourselves from the institutions.
It's a somewhat slippery argument, though, isn't it?
It's not really
to post facto say I don't actually believe in referendums because I mean the Parliament voted on. Obviously, you weren't in there at the time.
Sure,
but Parliament voted on it. The people voted.
It's a fair
said,
point
yes,
though, because what we've ended up doing, and the problem that Labour now faces is that the country is split on a divide that is not commensurate with not only the divide that we're used to our politics functioning on.
Yeah.
It's not commensurate with the divide that Labour would want to see. We've basically got... effectively, if you can look at this as a divide between old school liberalism and conservatism. You can look at this as the kind of, if you want to talk
social
about
liberalism and social
in terms
conservatism.
of like ideology, where you can see people with small c conservative values wanting to think that, the role of the state is to maintain order and preserve the status quo versus people who think like individual freedom, cosmopolitanism, whatever, i.e. like, Burke versus Locke, like the kind of silly ideological veil that ultimately conceals what is actually going on, which is all to do with material power relations.
Of course it is, Grace.
Yeah, exactly. This is the problem. We're just sitting up here
all
in the realm of
superstructural value
exactly.
stuff.
We're sitting up here in the realm of ideology, and it just completely prevents Labour from actually saying, look, these are the people that are benefiting from this system. These are the problems that are, most affecting you and most enriching elites, and we can't.
In a very
filter
concrete
that
sense,
process.
what do you think about this potential compromise? So
it's
Labour
not
made
gonna
some
happen.
demands. So you don't think it's going to happen? So it's just a moot point whether or not it should.
That Labour had to do it because they had to look like they were doing it. The
Had
Tories,
to do what, do you mean?
They had to go into the talks and
Yeah.
agree to look like they were, doing something constructive, and I think they've done that pretty well. I think actually there are some people involved in this process that have gone into it in good faith, actually, on the Labour side. The Tories obviously went into it in bad faith. They needed to scare the right wing of their party.
Yeah.
And now, we're just at this place where, it's just ridiculous. This isn't going to come anywhere. There's not going to be... Labour's going to have to get into the position where they're pushing for a people's vote, which is going to alienate a large portion of their constituency.
So you think that's inevitable now, even though you're opposed to it?
Oh, yeah. It's definitely inevitable. They're going to have to get into that position. It's going to alienate a large portion of their constituency, especially after the European elections. After that point, the electoral arithmetic won't have changed, and yet we still probably won't be able to get a general election. We definitely won't be able to get a second referendum. We end up coming up to Halloween again with absolutely nothing, and MPs knowing that they can just kick the can down the road again. A lot will be pushed into Europe's hands, so it will just end up carrying on and on and on and on until something happens. And I think what will probably happen is that we'll get a general election, even though that's not what people want. It will be a general election fought on Brexit. It will be disastrous, either delivering a minority Labour government with the support of a load of Remain parties that has to then deliver a referendum, or potentially, if I don't know what would happen. So if the Brexit party stood, that would take a load of votes off the Tories and then give a minority Labour government. But if it doesn't, and the Tories somehow get a new leader and manage to colonise the Leave side, then who knows? We might be in for another 5 years of Tory rule. It's all terrifying.
There was no glimmer of hope there, was there?
No, it's all bad.
Are you as depressed as Grace?
Not quite. Maybe that's more on
Give us a glimmer of
hope
hope,
than
go on.
expectation. But
And then we'll go on to your dire polling in Scotland.
well, I think when you look at how close certain options are and those indicative votes in Parliament, there is a glimmer of hope that we can clinch a majority once this process played out with the discussions.
In a future general election, you mean?
No, I think before that, I don't think. To be honest with you, I don't think there's the likelihood of a general election.
Oh, you mean for people's vote?
Yeah. So I think, but it's also critical how you frame that. Now, I know you had a sort of way of analysing it. My analysis of the whole situation and how this emerged is one about economic alienation. That's the consistent factor that I see both in the Scottish independence referendum and in the Brexit referendum. In my opinion, how I can visualise it. My visualisation of it is like a massive one of those kind of cartoon red buttons that you see in a Tom and Jerry cartoon with do not press, and the entire establishment all standing there in suits all going, now don't press that button if you know it's good for you. And then people just going, well, the whole system screwed me for the last 40 years, so what have I got to lose? Smack the red button. My constituency voted 57% to leave the UK in 2014, and then it kicked Labour out of the Westminster seat it held since 1935 in 2015, and I think my constituency is probably still a majority for independence.
Were you always personally passionate for Remain, or have you taken on this position because you can't go against your constituents on two constitutional questions?
That would be really counterproductive. No, I campaigned for Remain, kind of half-heartedly, I'd admit, because I did go out and do the job, but it's not something as emotionally as inspiring as something as visceral as like the UK, I suppose, in a sense. The sense of solidarity in the UK is much more obvious, but
and also the impact of being in the UK is pretty goddamn significant, whereas in many ways being part of the EU is somewhat marginal. Sure,
because the whole impact of monetary policy, for example, that's a huge question in Scotland in that regard. But yeah, so I had reasons to be sceptical of the European Union, but not to reject it. On balance, and it's been run by the right wing since the 1980s, well, since the 1990s, let's refer to as Maastricht. So there's a whole question over the democratic accountability of it, the whole question over how the Troika treated the the fringe economies, how in fact how the Eurozone is doomed to collapse because it's a monetary union without fiscal union is
I didn't have to
anti-democratic
make any of my arguments.
and doomed to collapse. But that doesn't mean that the core idea of the European Union is should be entirely destroyed. So that was where I was coming from. But going back to my point about alienation, I've got one of the
big red button.
I've got one of the poorest constituencies in the UK. So the areas that you used to go around and you could weigh the Labour vote, that you didn't really need to canvass because you just knew there were safe Labour people. You were having a massive rejection of Labour, angry rejection of Labour when the result went as they saw it the wrong way in 2014. There's a grief sitting about how their hopes and expectations, everything they'd pinned about a new future on independence, had been cruelly tarnished or dashed. And then they took it out on Labour. They said, you're meant to be on our side, and you got into bed with the Tories and you shafted us. You're not going to be forgiven for that. That was the kind of feel you were getting on the doors. You were getting told maybe I shouldn't repeat the stuff you were getting told, but it was really heartbreaking.
You're allowed to swear on the show.
It
was it libelous?
Well, it was just like
About you.
it was just like fuck off, you red Tory.
Yeah.
Getting that on the doors is brutal.
And you were supposed to be like, we always called. Oh, it wasn't the red. They were the tartan Tories, weren't they?
Well, they're the tartan.
The tartan Tories, the red Tories,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Tories.
So going from that in a community you've lived and known your whole life is pretty brutal. But the reality was the Yes campaign in the independence referendum was very effective at presenting, in my view, a chimera or a sort of mirage of project all your aspirations for society onto this ideal of independence, whether it's neoliberal small state, Celtic Tiger, if you like, model of Scotland, or whether it's a sort of Cold Water Cuba, as George Galloway called it. These were the kind of mutually exclusive ideas, but they were all galvanized to this one vision. And that was the art of the way the Yes campaign ran itself. It was able to combine all sorts of totally mutually exclusive ideas about what Scottish independence could be into one unifying purpose. And then that critically undermined the Labour movement, particularly in its heartlands. And I sense the same feeling with regards to how key Labour heartlands voted in the European referendum in 2016. In a sense, Scotland had got it out of its system in 2014. It got that kind of kick at the system, the establishment out of its system in 2014. That's why you saw all of Scotland's council areas vote Remain.
Do you think it was just a... So I suppose the way you're describing the Indie ref vote, which I think it was 55-45 or something like that.
Yeah.
So 45% of the Scottish population, you're saying...
A majority in Glasgow and a majority...
in your constituency, they sort of voted as a sort of unarticulated protest.
Sure.
Not particularly for anything.
It wasn't nationalist, but the allure of the nationalist idea was captivating, and I think the same idea has played out in Brexit. The nationalist concept of Britain became an allure, we should do things ourselves. Why are they telling us what to do? This idea that some unaccountable entity over there, this other entity, is sort of trampling on your rights, your capability, your capacity as a community.
I just want to get more concretely down onto why I suppose you oppose Scottish independence. As someone looking at it from south of the border, for me, sort of Scottish independence, I would have been Lexit if it seemed like there was sort of a positive vision for... Well, I also don't think that being part of the EU is that significant anyway. I don't think they have that much control over our economy. But if in Scotland it looked like you had a very progressive movement to leave a bloc which has screwed over Scotland for quite a long time. You have an electorate, so not just the government, but an electorate that seems significantly to the left of the rest of the UK. So could you not have quite a nice Norway-style, social democratic, fairly open to migration, social liberal society? I mean, it sounds kind of nice. I mean, what was the problem with that vision?
Because it wasn't credible, and there's a very fundamental reason for that Scotland benefits massively economically from its integration with the UK. There's a more fundamental level from a class analysis, class before country, that going to Labour conference in Liverpool last year, you're struck by the fact that Glasgow and Liverpool are essentially similar cities with similar histories, the class consciousness of those cities. Why on earth would you draw a distinction between those two as opposed to, the differences between Glasgow and Liverpool are far less than the difference between Glasgow and Edinburgh, where 40% of the kids in that city go to private schools. So why on earth would you draw an arbitrary distinction between those people in that sense? It doesn't make any sense from a class analysis point of view. That was, from a socialist point of view, the reasons why I didn't agree with it. But also, when you regard the redistributive model of the UK, obviously, traditionally, Labour's position has been to capture control of the UK government, the British government, in order to affect socialist policy from the centre and drive big state institutions into public control in order to redistribute wealth and power from a sort of very central approach. That's kind of been the traditional 1945 Labour government kind of adopted that sort of idea. Wilson government similarly. So from that point of view, Scotland has benefited and continues to benefit. So, for example, from every year, Scotland has a net benefit of £10 billion of a fiscal transfer. That's equivalent of the entire NHS budget in Scotland.
Wow.
You know,
So you
overnight,
think Scotland gets quite a good deal post-devolution?
Yes, absolutely. And pretty much all regions of the UK, London essentially generates the wealth and it's redistributed to other regions of the UK.
Isn't that a somewhat one-dimensional way of looking at it, though? Because that's a bit like the argument where you say, actually, the top 1% pay 50% of the tax, but that's because we have an economy which is so tilted that they make all the money. So if we have an economy that's tilted so that London makes all the money, of course there will be net redistribution out of it. But that's because, I suppose I'm going to throw this to you actually, Grace.
Okay.
If Scotland went independent, could it be a giant Preston?
Not under the SNP.
I think on this question, I mean, I basically think that I don't have a strong opinion for or against, to be honest. I think it should be left up to the Scottish people, and if there needs to be another referendum, then
Well, it's your country too.
yeah, I mean, it is.
It is, but if people want to secede, they can secede.
Yeah.
Well, that's the right of self-determination, yeah. But I suppose it's usually played out in a colonial relationship.
Well, I suppose I believe in the principle of subsidiarity, of kind of, governance being as close to the lowest level as possible as it can be. And the kind of economic arguments are similar to, I suppose, well, I would view them as similar to, well, they're different because obviously you do have that question about monetary policy, about the currency, etc., etc. But, in many ways that could be a net benefit to Scotland, not having to deal with the overvalued pound with exporting things like whiskey. But again, it's a similar kind of response to all the points about how leaving the EU is going to decimate the British economy, which very much take for granted a lot of the assumptions about how the economy works today. It is always, and all these models are ceteris paribus, if you were to do X, Y, or Z, then you would decimate, this industry here and that industry there. But of course, the whole point of that project would be that it wouldn't be ceteris paribus, or the idea behind that project is that it shouldn't be ceteris paribus. It's that you would be using...
So what you mean by that is it won't be all other things equal. You say,
Sorry.
if the economy stays exactly as it is, that will mean there's less money going from London to Scotland. But you're saying if there was a politically incredibly different situation, then potentially Scotland could
because
become
states play, and again, this
right.
is the point, we are never ever in any context dealing with a market which determines we are never dealing with a market that is determining who has the wealth and who has the power. We are dealing with a politically constructed set of market institutions that are constructed in the interests of the powerful. And any project that aimed to literally take back control of those institutions, whether that was a socialist project or, whether it's a socialist project in, or that's also couched in nationalist terms in Scotland, would have, and I'm not suggesting whether or not that socialist nationalist project is viable or positive. I'm just saying that, that has the potential to take control of the institutions and transform the way that those institutions, those economic institutions, work. And I can imagine a post-independence government in Scotland that did something like a Green New Deal, that had control over its own monetary policy, that was able to benefit in terms of exports from a devalued pound, and that would presumably also still be on the receiving end of some transfers from other parts of the world, and that could mitigate all those potentially negative points.
Well, the conclusion I drew from looking at the macroeconomics of an independent Scotland was that it would severely impede the capacity to provide public services, particularly when you look at the options of sterlingisation, which is what the Scottish Government's proposing, which would require a minimum of £40 billion in foreign exchange reserves to be developed. In order to do that, you would need to switch.
What does sterlingisation mean? Making your own currency?
Basically means using the pound as Panama uses the dollar.
Okay.
Oh, that's a terrible idea.
So it's essentially been sacrificing your monetary policy sovereignty, but also having to defend a peg against sterling.
Yeah, that would never work.
But there's an argument now to launch.
I like it. You've just been convinced. No,
there's-
stupid.
Well,
It should be independent.
It would only work if you had your own currency.
Well, exactly, and I mean the only option is at minimum would be to have your own currency free and floating. But in order to do that, you would still, in order to establish its credibility, need to have a minimum of £40 billion in foreign exchange reserves. My former lecturer, Professor Ronnie MacDonald at Glasgow University, is going to calculate this. Is quite a well-known figure in terms of international monetary policy. But the reality of that would need to mean you'd need to move the Scottish economy from being a deficit country to a surplus country in terms of its public finances. To generate that forex reserve, that would mean a massive impact on public service capacity. That's why I don't think it's a constructive way to proceed. But I agree with your point about subsidiarity. So I think there's a middle. That's a terribly centrist thing to say. It's middle way in order to reform this.
A third way.
A third way.
We call it a third way.
Yeah. And that's why I wanted a third option in that referendum. I didn't want to have a binary yes no. That's why I was driving at with my original comments. What I believe in is radical federalism in the UK, in order to embed constitutionally the structures of the Preston model you described. Similarly in Scotland, because the reality of 20 years of devolution, this week is the 20th anniversary of the first Scottish elections to the Scottish Parliament. The reality of 20 years of devolution has been it's actually Edinburgh sucked power from other parts of Scotland into Edinburgh. So you've had the effect of the
Closer than London, though, isn't it? I mean, if you've got it can either get sucked into London or it can get sucked into Edinburgh.
Yeah,
but Edinburgh
all other
compared to
things
the rest
equal.
of Scotland is like
it's a very wealthy city, yeah, and I think those are concerns that need to be addressed as well. So, for example, Glasgow has had massive, decline in its political power and influence over the last 20 years. So, it's not just about the Scottish angle or framing it in a purely Scottish context. It's actually saying, how do we structure the entire UK so that it isn't simply a dependent model based on a centralised approach to governance, that it's actually liberating economic creation, wealth creation in different parts of the UK. It's maximising local economic wealth. It's kind of challenging the neoliberal dogma of multinational corporations extracting wealth from communities that traditionally generated wealth and kept that wealth circulating within its own economy. These are all models that we need to challenge, and I think in a way by fragmenting the capacity of the state in one level, like in Britain, you actually impede the ability to challenge those orthodoxies, particularly in a European context or a global context. Ireland's a really great example. The difference between Irish GDP and gross national income, once you've accounted for all the wealth that's extracted from Ireland, is massive. Because Ireland has an economic model that essentially meant it sat on the periphery of Europe, set its tax levels, corporate tax levels, at a lower rate than the big economies, attracted massive amounts of foreign direct investment, which was a highly dependent economic model. And then all the profits are extracted back out of Ireland again to America, usually, where the main corporates
I mean,
are
if
based.
you were to do this, to be honest, I find that argument quite convincing. And if purely for kind of self-interested perspective, I would not like to see Scotland leave. But equally,
Sure.
I don't think it's up for us to.
Well, it's like why it's an hour to drive from Newcastle to Edinburgh. Why would you want a border between those two cities? It's just ridiculous.
Well, yeah, I mean,
You wouldn't need a border,
yeah,
would you?
yeah. Well, anyway,
Depends if you're in the
We're getting into the weeds now.
Are you in Maastricht?
but I think there are points there about what would make that model, if it were to be pursued, even a kind of a model of Scottish independence would completely and utterly have to have its own currency.
Sure.
And you would need foreign exchange reserves, to be able to do any form of central banking. They wouldn't have to be huge, but also there would be a mechanism to ensure that currency was competitive internationally, and that would help to boost Scottish demand. And if you have a stable tax system that underpins your capacity to raise revenues and issue bonds and all that sort of stuff, then ultimately you have a very solid basis for having that currency. And in Scotland, you have this huge problem of land. All this land concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite.
Another good book by Andy Whiteman, who owns Scotland.
Oh, yeah.
Very good. I mean, I think it's something like less than 400 people own 50% of the land.
It's absolutely mad.
Yeah.
And that would be a very solid
It's a throwback to
tax
feudalism.
base. Yeah.
Well, I'm a
Or
big
just
fan of a land value
expropriate
tax.
it.
Let's
Yeah.
do. We'll save Indy for now, because I think this should be the subject of a proper show where we have a bargain
Sure.
about it and we get someone from the Radical Indie campaign on.
Yeah.
I want to talk briefly about Labour in Scotland. While we're doing that, you can start asking questions, because I'll come to those afterwards. But I've mentioned the polls a couple of times. So the most recent one, SNP 43%, Tories 20%, Labour 17% as a national poll in Scotland. And I suppose instead of just asking you why you're doing so badly, I want to frame it in a slightly different way, which is that my impression of why Corbynism worked in the UK was that it was able to sort of form an umbrella. And people had talked about this for decades, like, oh, we need a left unity campaign, and everyone sort of creates their new left unity Facebook page, which everyone's going to join. And then, but Corbyn
It's nothing so futile as a call for left wing
unity. Exactly. Well, except there is nothing so futile as a call for left wing unity. But when Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party, that is essentially what happened. So anyone who was on the left got sucked into this same movement,
sure.
And it was very energising. So it felt like you had a lot of capacity in that organisation. Obviously, Labour came with a lot of capacity already, but sort of it was all channeled through it. And to me, it seems like that's going to be basically impossible for Scottish Labour, because that happened 2 years earlier with the Radical Indie campaign.
Yeah.
So there's no possibility of a left unity Labour in Scotland, because you're so divided on the referendum, and because most of the people with the energy are on the other side.
Well, the constitutional question in Scotland cut across the Labour heartland, if you like. So, say 40% of Labour voters voted for independence. So that's a big iceberg that collapsed off the glacier of Labour, I feel like, in Scotland. And it is a real challenge. What you actually saw in 2015 was a highly motivated SNP vote. So you had a lot of Labour people switching to the SNP, going out, and were motivated to kick the Labour Party in Scotland. So you had a big spike in turnout. What actually happened in my constituency was I only actually added about 800 votes to the 2015 result, but the SNP lost about 9,000 votes.
Wow.
So you had a collapse in the SNPs. My analogy is it's a bit like those kind of Pacific islands when the sea level rises and they're submerged, and then the tsunami kind of recedes and the little islands poke back through again. So that was kind of my constituency. Labour was this island that was just submerged in the tsunami of SNP support in 2015, and then it kind of the tide went back out again, and the island poked back through by 200
your
votes.
little head poking out.
Yeah, 242
Glasgow North East.
Just about, so I'm kind of there. But the reality was when we started when I started, this is like 2 years ago. I was in the midst of this election campaign. I mean, it was the party didn't think we'd had a chance in Scotland. There was very little resources put into Scotland in terms of trying to win the seats. There was no ground campaign. It was properly resourced. I didn't have an organiser. I had, 9 people helping me working out the back of a car, with a budget of about $4,000. So that was how we won that campaign, with some trade union backing and some local fundraising. It was very much a DIY, Art Attack style campaign. But what you did sense was a real switch of people who voted for the SNP and were coming back to Labour because they were really excited by the Corbyn project. And you had older people who were sceptical of Jeremy. But I'd actually say in the west of Scotland that had much more to do with accusations about his associations with elements of the Northern Ireland question. And I had issues to do with that, because that is a live issue in the west of Scotland as much as it is in Northern Ireland. So you had elements of that happening. So you had the churn of Labour. You had a Tory vote in my constituency that went from 1,000 to about 4,000 because of that. But then you had an inflow of people from the SNP in 2015 came back to Labour. So you had a weird kind of churn of votes going on. But what happened in the course of that short campaign was Labour moving from about 15% in the polls at the start of the short campaign to settling on about 27% on the polling day itself. So that was a huge change in support over a very short period of time. So what that does show you is the Labour vote and the vote in Scotland generally is very elastic. So it can move based on sensitivities. The average polling in Scotland does keep us at a relatively consistent level from what we got in the general election in 2017. My frustration is we haven't necessarily achieved a gear shift upwards from there. And certainly depending on, national polls tend to have quite a small Scottish subsample, and that has a big health warning on it because the SNP factor does skew the result substantially. And then also, when you look at the seat projections, they're based on uniform swings. And if you know Scotland, you'll know the Labour vote will be concentrated in certain regions rather than it being a sort of nationally spread. So uniform seat swings and predictions tend to be quite problematic to extrapolate from. So for those reasons, a lot of the polling I wouldn't necessarily get too wound up by.
It's interesting what you said about how, the last election there was this massive turnaround, and we obviously saw, across the country the biggest swing we've seen, however long.
But we had a lower base in Scotland because the SNP is sitting on a lot of... We're competing on the same territory for the votes with the SNP, so that's the challenge in Scotland. It's like if we had a sort of... I'm trying to think of the analogy, like a TIG group that actually was effective.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if that's even a valid analogy, but I mean, it's like the SNP recognised in the 80s, they were quite a right of centre party. We called them the Tartan Tories because they were actually quite a right of centre party. They were, they were Tories. Their heartlands were in traditionally conservative areas in Perthshire and Aberdeenshire and places like that. They recognised under Alex Salmond that the route to independence for them was to get Labour voters to vote for the SNP. So they rebuilt themselves as a new vehicle, and they set themselves up in a sort of opposition to neoliberal Blairite policies, PFI, privatisation. They set them, and the war in Iraq, etc. They set themselves in opposition to those policies, and then creeped into power by one seat in 2007. And then built their position from there, established a majority in the Scottish Parliament in 2011, then drove forward with their independence referendum, and that galvanising effect of the referendum, hardened their vote or brought a lot of Labour votes to them. So that's their strategy over the last 20 years has been to displace Labour in Scotland.
And have they been, I mean, I suppose we can talk about are they now, but over that last 20 years, for much of that period, have they genuinely been to the left of Labour?
No.
No?
I mean, in certain tokenistic senses, they are a more isolationist party, and they have a less. They were clearly in opposition to interventionist foreign policies. Well, it was a Labour achievement.
Oh, in Scotland.
Yeah.
Oh, was that Scottish Labour who put that through?
See, interestingly, this
Right,
is an interesting point. Labour abolished upfront tuition fees in Scotland in 2001 under Donald Dewar at that time. But what happened was there was an agreement after studying it that would be a graduate endowment fee. So it was about £2,000 you would pay in instalments after graduating and once you'd earned above a certain salary. And that would be directly used to fund bursaries for poorer students to access higher education. So it would be a redistributive model once you'd achieved a earnings bonus from the public benefit of your university education. The SNP, when they came to power in 2007, promised to scrap student debt altogether, to write off the student loan book. And I voted SNP. That was my first election I could vote in. I voted Labour in the constituency, and I voted SNP in the proportional regional list because I was attracted by the promise to get rid of student debt because I was going to university that year. And a lot of my peer group did. They won by one seat, and they never did abolish the student debt. The student loan book's grown massive. It's the biggest single asset that the Scottish Government have on their books. But what they did do is they scrapped the graduate endowment, and they claimed that was scrapping tuition fees.
Oh my God.
Because they claimed that was still a tuition fee that was by the back door. But the reality was it was actually a mechanism to redistribute wealth to people to create bursaries. And as a result of that in Scotland, the mobility of people from poor backgrounds getting to university through bursaries has been eliminated, and it's now entirely through loans.
Right, we won't have you argue against
the
SNP who are
in
the studio for too long. It's too easy for you.
But the thing is, the myth is out there that they did that. That's what they're really good at, is their information management. So even though the historical nature of it is much more complicated, the simple narrative and assumption is now, the SNP were doing that, when actually their policy in effect was counterproductive and anti-progressive. It was actually a regressive policy. So that's why when you're a Scottish Labour member, you find a lot of the time banging your head off a brick wall, especially when comrades in England make these assumptions about the nature of the SNP.
That's kind of already an answer to Madison P, who asks, what are the progressive arguments against the SNP and IndieRef? I think we've kind of covered that. I'm worried to canvass for Labour in Glasgow as I don't know how to
you're
respond
welcome up anytime.
to questions on independence from voters. Will you take Madison up personally?
You can come up and campaign in Glasgow North East anytime. We have a great bunch of people out, really committed activists, and the fact we've been through really tough times as well has made us all the more determined. So you're welcome to come. It's easy to be a Labour member when the times are good.
Now you get the more controversial question. I didn't know this, so I'm speaking for the people on the comments. What does Paul think of Jeremy's leadership, having previously signed a letter calling for his resignation?
Yes. Well, that's a fair point, and it's worth addressing. I suppose I could deploy the Owen Jones argument. No, to be fair, was in a situation in 2016 where I did feel that we were in danger of collapsing as a party. I did genuinely feel that, as a person who's grown up under a Labour government, I want nothing more than to achieve a Labour government, because I know the massive benefits it has for society, generally speaking. We can quarrel about the precise details of policy, but generally speaking, the thrust of Labour is generally a positive one. All the great achievements of the last century have been delivered by Labour governments. So my starting position is I want Labour to be in government. I had no major disagreements with Jeremy on policy at that stage, but I did at that stage have a massive crisis of confidence in his capacity to lead the party. I'll be honest about it.
How are you doing now?
Well, the thing is, I'm happy to admit that, when the facts change, you change your mind. Okay, people can claim that I lack intellectual purity for that position, but the reality is, my starting position is what maximises the opportunity for Labour to achieve government and to affect socialist policy. So, really, that situation, I had a crisis of confidence. Going into 2017, it's amazing how when you feel you're being attacked from the outside, you start to sort of, it's like a family, isn't it? You can have your disputes, but then you kind of all come together and fight for it together when you feel that you're being under attack from the outside. I was really unimpressed by the nature of the way Jeremy was being attacked, and I've become increasingly disillusioned with the motives of a lot of people who have attacked our leadership, and actually recognise that it's not to do with the best interests of the Labour Party, it's actually to do with naked factionalism. I've had a really rough education in that since I became an MP as well. Perhaps I was quite naive. I hadn't had a job in politics before I became an MP. I worked in engineering. I was a bit of a lay member. I was out there putting leaflets through just like anyone else. So I wasn't really fully involved in the minutiae of how these things operate within the party. Since becoming an MP, I've grown to know Jeremy really well. I know him to be a man of principle. I know him to be a very patient man. I know he's committed to party unity, which is why we're having this position over Brexit just now, where it is quite difficult because his main objective is to maximise party unity. It'd be the easiest thing in the world to just flip on one side of it, But no, I'm firmly of the belief that he is absolutely someone that the Labour Party needed at the right time. It was a cathartic moment for the Labour Party to rejuvenate and rediscover its purpose. Just intrigued to see what comments are coming through. But
No, this question's very different.
But
don't worry, I'm not going to keep grilling you on the decisions you made in 2016.
It's an enigmatic grin over there.
Yeah.
But I think it was in retrospect, a cathartic moment for the Labour Party.
We've all signed a wrong open letter every now and again.
Yeah.
Lol, what open letters have you been signing?
And to be fair, the SNP did weaponise it against me during the election campaign, because my opponent actually knows Jeremy as well. The SNP incumbent knew Jeremy and said, "Oh, well, we're friends with Jeremy," and he signed a letter against him. So actually, vote for the SNP if you really support Jeremy, because we'll prop him up. And it was just like the most convoluted argument, because now they're never stop attacking Jeremy in a highly personal way. So it just showed you how desperate the SNP were when they sensed the ground was slipping from them. But no, I think what's really frustrating me now is when we know how close we are to forming a Labour government, that we have the policy position that's enthused the country, that's built an electoral coalition that's clearly, on the cusp of power, as we were in 2017. It was like only a very slight swing we needed to actually establish ourselves in government. When you realise that that's where the opportunity lies, why on earth would you still be engaged in acts of sabotage? Why would you be attempting to undermine the party so viscerally? Instead of acting in a comradely way and in an attempt to persuade the party. And that's really why, the sort of Love Socialism, Hate Brexit campaign was formed out of that, because it wanted to set itself up in distinction to the People's Vote campaign, which is essentially a sort of obnoxious Lib Dem sort of thing that's sort of, totally Europhile and seems to have no nuanced opinion about the institutions of Europe, whatever, and it just seems to be entirely middle-class people sneering at working class people. That's my vibe from the People's Vote agenda. It just strikes me that you're too thick to vote the right way the last time, so have another go at it. and read all these, Guardian columns about how you're too stupid to, So I think that was really where we were coming from. We were trying to approach it from a comradely position in the party, saying we recognise there's flaws with the European Union. We on balance recognise that, there are massive risks as well. We want to maximise the opportunity for working class people, but we also critically want to make sure that we're doing this in a comradely way that isn't in any way trying to undermine the leadership of the party, and it's actually about maximising the opportunity for a Labour government with Jeremy as Prime Minister. That's essentially where we were trying to set this thing up. That's why we've been kind of reluctant to voice our opinions before now, because it was potentially going to be framed as, it's an act of sabotage.
The comments aren't bad, actually. M. Boyle, 1888. I don't know if the date has any significance.
It's the year Celtic was formed.
Ah, so that probably is it. Because I'm a constituent of Paul's in Glasgow East, and I'm impressed with him. Will come out to increase your majority next election.
Oh, cheers. That's nice to know.
The question I was grinning at is from Crystal Mephistopheles. And,
wow.
I know what your answer is going to be to the first part of this, but the second part will be interesting. So,
yeah.
How plausible do you think it, and you can do the first part, how plausible do you think it will be for Corbyn to just say fuck it and go full Lexit as well as deselecting all Labour MPs?
Well, that might beat Ramsay MacDonald in terms of a party split.
Let's put mandatory selection in there. That's a plausible thing. Mandatory selection, your position on it.
Well, the SNP have mandatory selection.
Oh, do they?
Yeah, so I mean, it's not something that's that big a deal, to be honest with you. I'm not that hung up on it. Maybe it's because I've not really been an incumbent for a long time. But and interestingly, I wasn't selected by local members because of the short nature of the 2017 snap election. The Scottish Executive Committee selected all the candidates. So I think I'm up for testing myself. With the local party members, they all seem to be. They might not have known me that well before I became the MP, but they certainly know who I am now, and I think most of them would probably think I'm doing an all right job. So I'm not that averse to the idea of that testing with democratic membership. I suppose there's a question over, making sure that it's not corrupted, because what you can do is see a lot of people. Well, there's elements where there's risks of people buying memberships and sort of surging the local party with people to get their particular person elected. And I think if you've got a very sudden shift in the membership within a short period of time, immediately prior to selection, for example, I think that would be problematic. I would want to have safeguards against it being stuffed with, people who have been bought, and that corruption element into it. So as long as there were safeguards against corrupting it, I'd be comfortable with it. Yeah,
I'm up for open primaries, but that's not really
obviously.
That's another thing.
Mandatory reselection. That's just no question whatsoever.
Would you do open or closed?
What's the difference again?
So in America, anyone can vote in a primary.
Oh no.
No.
Yeah.
That's the leftist argument, because you build the cadre, and the cadre
Wait,
do
so
the voting.
anyone that doesn't have to be a member.
Yeah, well, you'd have to be a registered supporter or something like that.
But
essentially, it's very easy to vote. So the point is, you could
to
canvass the
the
whole
party
community, not just Labour Party members.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. What was I going to ask? Oh, this is when there's too many things to look. There was a question that I liked, which was, do you support the child of Harry and Meghan being titled the Earl of Dumbarton?
Earl of Dumbarton.
Is that a potential? Is that what they're going to be called?
I've heard of this, actually.
Are you a Republican?
If I didn't have a monarchy today, I wouldn't want one.
Yeah.
Right, but I'll recognise
But she's just so nice.
I think we should move towards a model much like the Dutch have, or whatever, where you've got the kind of monarch, if you like. I don't have fair enough, there's a traditional element. Fair enough. I'm not going to It's
picking your battles, isn't it?
Picking your battles, I suppose, and you don't want to upset people.
But
I would get rid of the amount of public money that's invested in the royal family. I think it's obscene, particularly when you factor in the amount of money that the military are involved in spending in regards to battalions of guards outside Buckingham Palace and royal weddings and all that sort of stuff, which comes at massive public expense. I don't see why people outside the immediate monarch and spouse not just going and having normal jobs outside of having, why are they involved in public duties altogether?
I think either get rid of them completely or give us a bank holiday for everything that they do. Because every time they do something, the press goes mental. And if we have to put up with that, we should have a bank holiday.
Yeah.
We don't get, but do we get a bank holiday for the babies, just for the weddings?
No.
And
we don't even get bank holiday for some of the weddings.
We only got bank holiday for William and Kate's
Yeah.
because they're next in line.
It's bullshit.
I mean, I would actually have a democratic check on it. So the succession should be ratified by Parliament. So maybe there should be a vote on who succeeds the Queen. Why should we have hereditary succession?
I reckon just get rid of them.
Oh, what? So you think Parliament should just elect a new head of state? I think that's what they do in Italy, isn't it?
I think so. I'm not sure.
Because they have a president instead of a king. But
Yeah.
it's this that sort of ceremonial.
So in
not
a sense,
ceremonial role,
so in a
but
sense, you could have a de facto monarchy where, you know, as long as Parliament wants to maintain the kind of lineage, if you like, they would vote for it. But why have it as an automatic right of succession? Maybe that's a kind of healthy compromise where it injects a bit of democratic tension into it. Maybe we could have hustings for who should succeed the Queen between like Prince William and Prince Charles, and sort of put a national debate on.
I mean, if you can skip it to Will, I think that would probably be a vote winner. All right, I think we should call it a day. It's 9:15.
Wow, time flies.
I want to get another beer from our mini fridge, which we purchased a month ago with your kind donations. That's not the main
Why
thing they go on.
Why are you telling them that
It's
you
not the
bought a
main
mini
thing we
fridge?
know go on, but it's really hot in here, and we didn't have any way of keeping anything
No
cold.
one cares. That you should be working harder.
Anyway, thanks for the mini fridge, guys.
I've enjoyed this mojito actually.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, thank you for watching Titsky Sour. Thank you so much, Grace Blakeley, as ever.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul Sweeney.
Cheers.
Your first time on Navara.
Yeah,
We'll have
hopefully
you
not my
back
last.
soon, I'm sure. And thank you for watching. If you are a kind subscriber to Navara Media, thank you. You're what makes this possible. You're why Navara Media can expand. If not, please go to support.navaramedia.com, and you know that our ask is for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Like this video, share this video, keep up your comments. Good night, and we'll see you next week.